Today we will look at which countries have banned polar bear hunting, the top ones contemporary regulations. Beginning in the middle of the 1950s, governmental rules on polar bear hunting were created in response to worries about the species' long-term survival. In 1956, the Soviet Union outlawed all hunting. In 1968, Canada enacted hunting limits. From 1965 to 1973, Norway enacted a number of progressively stringent rules, and since hunting has been entirely prohibited. The Marine Mammal Protection Act was enacted in 1972 when the United States started to regulate hunting. All 5 countries Euro, Canada, Denmark, Norway, the Soviet Union, and the United States Euro, whose territory is home to polar bears, signed the International Agreement on the Conservation of Polar Bears in 1973. Member nations concurred to impose limitations on hunting for sport and for profit, prohibit hunting from aircraft and icebreakers. There exist agreements between nations to jointly manage their polar bear subpopulations. Russia and the United States agreed to jointly set quotas for native subsistence hunting in Alaska and Chukotka in October 2000 after several years of discussions. October 2007 saw the ratification of the agreement. The polar bear range states adopted a Circumpolar Action Plan in September 2015, outlining their polar bear conservation strategy. The species is included in Appendix 2 of the Convention on International Commerce in Endangered Species, CITES, which means that the transboundary system of permits and certificates governs all international trading, including trade in parts or derivatives. The U.S. government has suggested adding polar bears to CITES's Appendix I, which would outlaw all commercial hunting of them. Canada, April 1986 and April 1991, respectively. Reassessments and confirmations of this status were made in April 1999, November 2002, and April 2008. The Canadian government continues to identify polar bears as a species of particular concern due to both their vulnerability to overfishing and the anticipated range reduction brought on by the melting of the Arctic sea ice. In Canada, more than 600 bears are killed annually by humans, a pace that experts have determined is unsustainable for some regions, including Baffin Bay. Since 1970, sport hunting has been permitted in Canada with the assistance of local guides and dog sled teams, although the activity did not become widespread until the 1980s. Sport hunting guiding offers meaningful job and an enjoyable pastime. 80% of Canada's yearly killings occur in the region of Nunavut. Despite objections from the IUCN Polar Bear Specialist Group, the Nunavut government increased the limit in 2005 from 400 to 518 bears. In 2 regions where harvest levels were raised in accordance with there have been more sightings, scientific investigations have shown that numbers are dropping, and a 3rd location is thought to lack data. While the indigenous Inuit hunt the majority of the quota, an increasing portion is marketed to recreational hunters. 0.8%, 7.1%, and 14.6% in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, respectively. Mitchell Taylor, a polar bear scientist for Nunavut who was once in charge of polar bear conservation in the territory, has asserted that bear populations are being maintained under the territory's present shooting restrictions. The 2005 rise was largely undone in 2010. Polar bear quotas for the Baffin Bay region will be gradually decreased from 105 per year to 65 by 2013, according to the government of Nunavut. The Northwest Territories government continues to set its own quota of 72 to 103. In Canada, polar bear hunting quotas are maintained in such a way that efforts to discourage sport hunting would, in the near term, result in more bears being killed. Each year, Canada allots a set number of licenses for both sport and subsistence hunting. Permits that are not used for sport hunting are then redistributed for use in subsistence hunting for Indigenous people. Only 50% of sport hunters with licenses actually manage to kill a polar bear, whereas northern tribes kill all the polar bears they are permitted to capture each year. A sport hunter's permit cannot be transferred to another hunter if he or she does not harvest a polar bear before it expires. A national polar bear conservation strategy was issued by Environment Canada in August 2011, ordered annually. There were certain hunting laws in place. Greenland. Hunting restrictions in Greenland were originally implemented in 1994 and increased by executive order in 2005. Indigenous peoples' access to firearms in Greenland was unlimited until 2005. However, it set a maximum of 150 and, for the first time, permitted recreational hunting in 2006. The year-round protection of mothers and cubs, prohibitions on the use of firearms, and so many administrative procedures to track killings were also included in the stipulations. Norway. In Svalbard, Norway, polar bears were widely hunted during the 19th century and up until 1973, when a protection convention was formed. In the 1920s, 900 bears were murdered annually, and after World War II, 400 euro, 500 bears were cu. Poisoning was made illegal in 1927, and some denning sites were prohibited in 1939. In 1965, it became unlawful to kill females and cubs. Before the accord, polar bear murders had slightly diminished. Despite this, there were only about 1,000 polar bears remaining in Svalbard by 1973 as the population continued to decrease. They didn't start getting better until after the pact was signed. Russia. Polar bear hunting was outlawed in the Soviet Union in 1956, but poaching persisted and is now seen to represent a significant danger to the species. Due to the melting sea ice, polar bears have been coming closer to coastal settlements in Chukotka in recent years, putting people in risk and raising worries about the spread of illegal hunting. The Worldwide Fund for Nature and Russia's most renowned bear researchers supported the Russian government's 2007 decision to allow subsistence hunting for indigenous Chukotka people exclusively as a method of reducing poaching. Depending on population, polar bears now are categorized as rare, uncertain status, or rehabilitated and rehabilitating in the Red Data Book of Russia. The Russian Gov's Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment released a conservation plan for grizzly bears in 2010. United States. Polar bears were given partial protection in the United States under the Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972. It prohibited importing polar bear parts, aside from pelts properly obtained in Canada, killing, unless by indigenous subsistence hunters, and harassing polar bears. The melting of the Arctic sea ice was cited as the polar bear's main concern by the United States Department of the Interior on May 15, 2008.